So what I want to do is start with this first image, Nick. Is anybody familiar with this image? Calling you out maybe a little bit this morning. I'm just going to make an adjustment because I need to see these images. And this is not working. So I'm an artist, and I'm interested in being really open to my work being informed by different sources. There are things that I pay attention to as an artist. I'm really curious about the ways in which information is organized. I'm very interested in the materiality of things and how a combination of the information and its materiality can convey particular meanings, concepts, ideas, histories. I'm really interested in this map. In a way, it's offering a bit of a commentary, and it's offering this layer of information that really impacts our understanding of the contour of this country. And so maybe based on your education, you might know all these states by name just based on the contour. We're not provided the name of the state, we're provided the shape, and then we're given this other layer of information that in a way impacts our reading of that understanding, of that history. There's also some coding here. There's some vocabulary that you may have access to, or it may prompt a little research after this presentation. You're also probably thinking about the demographics that break down this map. Maybe the politics or the kind of political representation, depending on whether it's a blue state or a red state or kind of more purple state. You're also probably confronting your understanding of notions of identity in relation to some of this language. So I really like the way that this is operating because the body isn't necessarily present. You're accessing it based on your understanding of this particular language, English. There is, in a way, some color coding happening as well, as far as what's behind these words. And then if you're unfamiliar completely with this language, maybe Pornhub is new to you. Again, it could be a prompt, you know, so something that you might take away, maybe piques your curiosity. Those approaches to representation I find really complex, but delivered in a way that comes across as really simplistic, very direct. So just as I've been talking, you probably were doing all that processing. You didn't need me necessarily to point out those different operations. You were doing that on your own. And I'll have the next slide. So this is another relationship that interests me in representations of sex. How many people are familiar with this painting or this image? Okay, nice. So some of you already have some context for this. I'm not an art historian, but I am a studio artist. And I have some awareness of this painting. But what I'm curious about is both the language that art historians have provided about this painting, and then maybe the intention of the artist. And our ability to access that intention, there could be a lot of debate around that. We don't have the benefit of a YouTube video of Manet describing all of his intention. But I just want to point out a few things. And again, this might be a prompt for you to do your own kind of research on this work. But we are looking at the display of two figures. One is reclining, appearing to be accessible in some ways. There is a particular kind of posture. There is a bow in the hair. The feet are a little bit stained. And there's a cat that you may not be able to see because of the lighting. Can anybody see the cat? No, okay. But there is a cat as well. To the right, kind of doing that kind of gesture. So there's been a lot of debate around this image and the intention of Manet. And in some ways, there is a reading of a critique of other representations of morality in the history of painting, the history of representing women. And this offers a bit of a contrast because this is clearly a Parisian prostitute who is displaying her curves in a very unambiguous fashion. She's also flanked or supported by a figure in the background. And in a lot of the debate around this image, there's a lot of analysis of the posture of her body and whether this is a critique of Paris at the time. But there's not much attention given to the background, and that is the figure, the attendant that provides the flowers. In fact, you might not come across much description of her. And she provides this really clear contrast with respect to her apparel and that she operates in this way that kind of activates the background, provides a kind of compositional balance. She's clothed, the woman in the foreground is unclothed, and there's a certain kind of provocativeness about the way that she's positioned. So we might imagine the patron, the person who might be looking upon this image, desiring her, and there's a bit of status that she has because there is an attendant there. But for the most part, there is kind of a centerfold quality that she has. And so I want to contrast that image with the next slide. Is anybody familiar with this image? So this is a work by Renee Cox, and it's a photograph. And Renee Cox is both the sitter in this image, and she is in charge of composing the display that we see. You can see that clearly there is a dialogue with the previous image I showed you. So there's an attempt to kind of revise or subvert or provide a narrative that's in relation to the previous image. A few things about her posture. She is displayed somewhat similarly to the other image that we saw, the other reclining nude. There's been some interesting substitutions. Some of the kind of European aesthetic that we saw in the previous image has been shifted for more kind of African influenced decoration, ornament. The title has been retained, but there's a little addition, and that addition is boys, in a classic Boys in the Hood kind of way. So there's like a little bit of vernacular that's provided. And in a way, the figures in the background are no longer this attendant providing flowers, but they kind of serve as guardians or maybe protectors. They're holding these spears, and they have a very kind of stoic body language. So the kind of servitude that we saw in the previous image has changed. So these are Renee Cox's sons, and that knowledge adds this other dimension to how we might view her body. So not only does she kind of have an empowerment because of the way that she's positioned, but we might also think about her as mother, as the creator of these guardians behind her. And it provides a kind of display of her womanhood and her sexuality that are dually present in how we look at this image. So sexy and kind of provocative, and also there's a sense of empowerment. I'll show you another image, the next slide. Is anybody familiar with this image? A few? So this might be another prompt for takeaway research, but this is an image, a cartoon that is recording a particular vicious kind of story about this woman, Sarah Baartman, who was a enslaved person in South Africa, in Cape Town. And British ships came to Cape Town to explore, and they were a bit taken by the population of the Khoikhoi people. And the Khoikhoi people were, some might regard, very voluptuous in their bodies, in their presentation. And this British doctor was quite taken with the contours of this people. And so there's debate around this part of the story, but he enticed Miss Baartman to go away with him to London. And in some ways, this might have been a very curious opportunity for Sarah, because she's an enslaved person, and this opportunity for fame and fortune and a new land might have been very appealing. So at about 20, she trusted these people that she encountered to go on this voyage, this very long voyage. And upon arriving there, she was in some ways put on display as a bit of an oddity or a kind of spectacle because of the kind of exaggerated features that they perceive to be her body, or the perception of exaggeration of her body, particularly the roundness of her buttocks and the size of her genitalia in general. So this cartoon in some way depicts the engagement with her by various people. You have a woman who appears to be kind of looking under her skirt. She has on this kind of traditional dress. And then you have these other gentlemen who appear to be Scottish. They have on kilts. And you see there's kind of an inspection happening. The dog is kind of looking up the skirt. And then there's this other person who seems to be comparing himself to the rear of this woman. So there's this kind of morbid fascination with her sex, this reading of her as primitive. And I think all of this is informed by notions of superiority by the people who are encountering her. So Sarah's story is pretty sad. She, some would argue, was kind of trapped in this new place and was participating in this method of display that she might not have known would happen when she agreed upon traveling. She would later travel to Paris, and this kind of freak show performance would continue. And then later she would have to become a prostitute because there were no employment opportunities. And even in her passing, her body was encased and her genitalia was pickled, and that was on display for many, many years after. So this kind of really grotesque display of pornography and science, this kind of aberrant body and this desired body are all present in the way that we think about Sarah's story. Next slide. So some people like to revisit that history when thinking about popular depictions of women, specifically of African descent, in media, in visual culture and popular culture. So I'm just offering kind of two examples. How many people are familiar with Outkast? Pretty good group. And so there's a bit of a display going on your left, in which, again, they're clothed. The women around them provide a kind of excess. They frame the figures. They maybe add value to how we perceive them, their masculinity. And on your right, Quentin Tarantino. If you saw Django, you might be familiar with this woman who's depicted. And she maybe further complicates the ways in which I present those other references, because she's both on display, adding this contrast through the presentation of her body. And this arm that's placed on Tarantino feels a bit in control, doesn't necessarily read as victimized, or we could kind of talk about a dynamic of those readings when we look at this image. Have people seen this image before? Some nodding, some shaking, okay. Let's go to the next image. So I've decided to offer connections of my own work to artists that I'm interested in, because I think that there's kind of a shared language or shared sensibility, and sometimes just approaches to material that piqued my curiosity. So in the very first image, I showed you this symbol that you're familiar with, the US flag, all this language on top. But the kind of provocation in that work is based on your understanding of all those codes, all those references to pornography. In this image, maybe there's some familiarity. Maybe you're aware of popular music video, magazines like King. Kelly Walker does this really clever thing with very familiar materials. So there's this magazine cover with this beautiful woman, and he squirts toothpaste all over it. And I can't help finding some humor in his use of toothpaste as a way of talking about whitening, or as a way of talking about his whiteness in relation to this image. So there's a quality of kind of portraiture that's splayed on the cover of this magazine. And in some ways, it's in dialogue with the work of someone like Jackson Pollock, who's kind of known for these drip paintings and this kind of macho 1950s abstract expressionism. So there's a conversation, I think, between these two. Pollock is working on the surface, on the floor, and Kelly Walker kind of subtly, and maybe not so subtle, paints this picture in our mind of maybe a performance of his own. You see me gesturing like this. Of his own kind of performance that then layers upon this image. So the next slide is another magazine, and this is a magazine that really interests me. Particularly, this issue represents one of my first, in my memory, one of my early representations of a Black painter in popular culture. So you can do your own little back research on J.J. Evans. But I'm showing you the cover of Jet magazine. How many people are familiar with Jet magazine? Oh yeah, okay. And so on the right, table of contents, and it gives you a sense of what's featured in this publication. And you're probably reading, and midway down, Jet Beauty of the Week. Anybody familiar with Jet Beauty of the Week? My friends, yeah. So Jet Beauty of the Week is well, Jet magazine is a weekly, and that magazine has since about 1950 featured a centerfold, or a display of women in swimsuits. And these women in swimsuits are accompanied by a profile, a description of either their interests, their educational attainment, maybe other kinds of career pursuits. So the next slide shows you an example of that. And I'm not sure how readable that text is, but with those images in mind that I've shown you previously, there's something for me very intriguing about the relationship between the figure on display and the text on display. The figure on display provides you with a portrait, if you will. Someone's participating in this kind of presentation of them, their bodies, and maybe in some ways readings of their sexuality. And then this text is a kind of narration of who they are. And so I'm interested in that as two kinds of portraits. And my interest as well is this publication as a kind of archive of all of these women. So the next image is a piece that I made in response to my interest in Jet. It's Beauty of the Week. Did anyone see or hear this work? It was in the Pittsburgh Biennial a couple years ago, a few people. So for some of you that are familiar with this, pardon the repetition, but again, hopefully the sex theme provides maybe another way to access my interests. So my space within the Warhol Museum was the elevator. I chose that site as a space to hear sound. And this sound was recorded over many weeks. And my interest in portraiture through a kind of text-based representation, again, going back to that first slide that I showed you of the map, was the kind of material that I thought might add this new layer or an alternative layer to how we think about this archive of women's bodies as displayed in Jet magazine. So upon entering this elevator, you see the text, All My Girlfriends. That was the title of the piece. And you would hear audio being read. The audio would be something like this. October 11th, 1973. Sailing, swimming, dancing, and fencing are among the hobbies of this attractive mistress of the seas, Linda Sue Ragsdale from Dallas, Texas. Measuring 34, 22, 34, the leopard skin clad miss is also a modeling instructor. October 18th, 1973. Braving the rocks and waves of a Los Angeles beach, Anita L. Simmons takes a pause from her work as a clerk. Her principal hobby is that of a smooth, interpretive jazz dancing. October 25th, 1973. The toasty brown figure of ebony fashion fair model Suzaline McDonald can be seen dancing for the MGM Hotel in Las Vegas, Nevada, her home. She also enjoys horseback riding. So there's 5.7 hours of that. And depending on when you enter, it's either in the 70s or 80s or 90s. And it kind of ran close to the hours of the Warhol, so that thing just kept playing. And some people stayed in the elevator a little longer than they normally would. And there is an awkwardness, because you're in the elevator, they're already a bit of an odd space. You're kind of unusually close to people you don't know sometimes. And you're hearing the descriptions of these women's bodies and often their measurements. And I guess the title displayed on the doors of the elevator give you some context. All, that's a lot of girlfriends. And then my, who is that? So in a way, I chose to represent my relationship to this publication, and in a way that is maybe a bit more subtle in that I'm removing the body that's so charged in some of the ways that I talked about earlier, but also very direct. I'm just taking this provided script and reading it for you. I'm kind of gendering or kind of queering differently the way that we think about who the narrator is and maybe who the audience is. Because the centerfold is often, in the case of a publication like Jet, assumed to be a straight readership, Or in the case of that centerfold, certainly there aren't women desiring the women that are on display. So my gesture, albeit simple, for me is kind of complicating or inverting how we might understand the history of that archive. The next image, how many people are familiar with Sir Mix-a-Lot's Baby Got Back? Yeah, yeah you are. So again, apologies for people that already know that I parodied this, so this might be repetitive. But these two images are a part of the intro that's kind of underrepresented in the narrative around this song. I would offer interesting comparison to that Manet painting in which Laure, who is the name of the person who represented the attendant, is a bit absent from how we think about that painting. So I just want to show you a little of this intro. Anybody want to toss out a little bit of that? What did you hear? She looks like a prostitute. Anybody else? Look. She looks so black, right? And she's probably won the attention of these rap guys, whoever those rap guys are, right? So there's a bit of parody. There's some stereotype of this like, oh my God, Becky, right? Stereotype Valley girl, California kind of thing happening. So there's parody upon parody. And then there's this woman rotating around. We never really see her face, right? Shapely, lovely, form-fitting attire. But there's this weird connection between this notion of excess in her body and prostitution. Whoa, that's so intense to me. I just thought that she had a spectacular outfit on and knew how to move her body. So that connection is a bit odd. I want to show you my own work in dialogue with this piece, because in some ways I think that without the context of this narrative in the beginning, you could kind of unpack that video with very particular kind of popular language, like the objectification of women and this really kind of formulaic way of selling music and selling ideas, and all the kind of power that Sir Mix-a-Lot and all the other guys have as a result. So I'll show you a little bit of this.
I like big butts and I cannot lie. You other brothers can't deny that when a girl walks in with an itty bitty waist and a round thing in your face, you get sprung. Wanna pull up tough cause you notice that butt was stuffed. Deep in the jeans she's wearing, I'm hooked and I can't stop staring. Oh baby, I wanna get with ya and take your picture. My homeboys tried to warn me, but that butt you got makes me so horny. Ooh, rump of smooth skin. You say you wanna get in my Benz? Well, use me, cause you ain't that average groupie. I seen her dancing. The hell with romancing, she's wet, wet. Got her going like a turbo vet.
All right. That's on YouTube if you didn't get enough. So there's a bit of a contrast here, but very simply, a shift of the narrator, which maybe complicates the way that we think of the audience. There's a different kind of consumption that impacts how we think about the theme of the song. And I guess the critique that we get in the beginning is still a bit present. So there's this way of analyzing the body on the part of the Valley Girls that Sir Mix-a-Lot is responding to, because he's saying, you know, I'm tired of these displays of what beauty is. I'm so into this other thing, and I'm gonna offer kind of a critique of that by this really exaggerated display of the kinds of women that he desires. And so I am, in a way, rejecting all of that imagery, but also delivering a lot of imagery to you. Maybe that's happening a bit more internally. I think that my interest is in you interrogating the kinds of images that come to mind when you hear me rhyme the song. And the next image. So this work was a part of an exhibition at Space Gallery, a group show, and projected on a screen. And in some ways, I'm interested in just the humor, the kind of spectacle of hearing a woman rhyme in this way with maybe the same kind of speed and cadence as the original speaker. But also, maybe that kind of twisting offers this other way of thinking about the ways that gender performance happen or the ways in which sexuality can be represented in popular culture. And the next image. Additionally, I've been thinking about text and all those politics of kind of desire that come across not just in a performance, but also in the kind of visual display. And just as I was interested in kind of the archive in that previous work, that archive as a material, or the audio as a material, or the site of the elevator as a material, I'm interested in kind of text as this really accessible, readable medium. And the kind of support that that text can land on, if it is a fine art paper versus a brown paper bag, it can feel even more readable. There's something familiar about it. So I suppose a lot of that content that I use to introduce these ideas are present for me in this piece, although I don't think it's necessary to have all of that content delivered to access this. I think that you as a viewer begin to interrogate representations of Blackness and representations of desire when you read the text. And also the way in which it's depicted in terms of the positive being the negative space. The part that I'm actually painting is the space around the text. And in effect, the space around is defining, narrowing what's within. So a very simple gesture. And the next slide. And then this depiction of kind of desire and longing interests me in the readability of this work. Even the pace is slower, and maybe there's a subtlety in the work. And at the same time, there's a kind of directness and minimalism that I find really appealing in some of my drawings and paintings. So I've kind of provided you a presentation that has some linearity to it because it's in this Keystone format or PowerPoint format. But that actually is a misrepresentation of how I've kind of arrived at some of my ways of working. Upon reflection, I've recognized that some of the choices that I was making kind of had a history, but it wasn't necessarily at the forefront of how I work creatively. That reflection allowed me to pay attention to certain legacies of my ideas or a legacy of my making. So I wonder if, for you, it might be interesting to reflect upon your ways of working, no matter what your occupation, no matter what kinds of tools you use. I wonder if there is a history of making or a particular model that has a legacy that it would be worth interrogating or interrupting or subverting, just as a kind of creative exercise. How might that change the ways in which you produce? Might that offer a kind of analysis of how you work that might yield a set of ideas that are different? How might that shift, alter positions of power? And how might it create a space for you to make things in a way that might be quite different than you intended to make?